the creation of Nazi Germany at a time when the economic crisis was raging in Germany. Political power was in the hands of Brüning, who belonged to the Centre Party. Lacking a majority in Parliament, Brüning's cabinet resorted to extraordinary decrees of the president that were not authorized by Parliament, through which he enforced a dictatorial, anti-labor policy. And this meant that the democratic character of the Weimar Republic was lost. But despite this, the Social Democratic Party supported the Brüning cabinet. The dictatorial tendencies characteristic of the Brüning government intensified further after the formation of Papen's cabinet in June 1932. In July, the Papen government expelled the Social Democrats from the Prussian government and took control of the Prussian police apparatus, but it's known that he who rules Prussia rules all of Germany. Papen's actions were an open challenge to the Weimar Republic as a whole. Some authors often point out that the path to fascism was open because this time the Social Democratic Party did not resist the actions of the Papen government, although it was at that time that the anti-fascist forces led by the working class consolidated. In the general election in November 1932, the Nazis immediately lost 2 million votes, while the Communist Party received about 6 million. The offensive of the workers intensified. Faced with the onset of anti-fascist forces, President Hindenburg, who sought to rally the forces of reaction, January 30, 1933, the day after the 10,000th demonstration against Nazism took place in Berlin, appointed Hitler the Chancellor. So the Nazis came to power, calling for the overthrow of the Weimar Republic. If under these conditions a unified anti-fascist front of the Communist and Social Democratic parties were created, the formation of the Hitler government 78 could have been prevented. However, the Social Democratic Party reacted negatively to cooperation with the Communist Party and repeatedly rejected the United Front it proposed. When the Hitler government was formed, the Social Democratic Party again abandoned effective action against Nazism on the pretext that the formation of this cabinet was a completely legal act. Some mistakes were also made by the Communist Party. For example, they believed that its organizational activity among the workers of large enterprises turned out to be insufficient. In addition, it was not able to channel the discontent of the German people along the Versailles Peace Treaty in the right direction. But one way or another, it was the lack of solidarity of all the forces of the nation that opposed the Hitler government that was the main cause of the calamities that later fell on the German people. Having come to power, the Nazis immediately dismissed the Reichstag and, in preparation for the general election scheduled for March 5, launched a fierce terror. On the night of February 27, they set fire to the Reichstag, accusing the Communist Party of this. The next day, the government issued a decree on the protection of the people from disasters caused by the Communists, on the basis of which the members of the Reichstag, the Communists, were arrested, and freedom of speech and assembly was liquidated. March 1, a decree was issued on the dissolution of the Communist Party. But despite this, in the March 5 general elections, the Nazis received only about 43% of the vote, while 12 million voters voted for the Communist and Social Democratic parties. In this regard, Hitler, introducing into the parliament a draft of the so-called Law on the Transfer of Power, demanded that the Reichstag grant him the rights of a dictator and received his consent to this. The Social Democrats opposed this decision, but it was too late. In June, the government dissolved the Social Democratic Party. Following this, orders were issued to dissolve the Center Party and other political parties. So the dictatorship of the Nazi Party was established. After the death of President Hindenburg 79 in the summer of 1934, Hitler concentrated both the power of the president and the power of the prime minister in his hands. So the statement of the Nazi regime of the Nazis was completed. But the Nazi regime could not bring relief to Germany, which was in the grip of an economic crisis. Therefore, in order to maintain power, it was necessary to suppress numerous anti-Nazi forces. One after another, the arrests of anti-Nazi elements followed. The people were completely deprived of freedom of speech, freedom to criticize state policy. But what did Hitler promise the people? As a means of overcoming the crisis, he put forward the thesis about the need to revive the army, expand the military industry, eliminate unemployment by attracting labor to construction work. All this in itself meant preparation for war. Guns instead of butter, that was Göring's slogan, which was Hitler's right hand. As a result of the arms race, the military power of Germany was steadily increasing. In an effort to weaken the people's discontent with the internal situation in the country and to draw his attention to foreign policy problems, Hitler, along with the reorganization of the entire state system, embarked on the path of open aggression against foreign states. Building socialism in the Soviet Union, the economic crisis has put the world ahead of a military catastrophe. Only one country made an exception in this respect: the Soviet Union. In the USSR, unlike the capitalist countries, industrial production also grew rapidly during these 3 crisis years. But it is understandable that the economic crisis could not but have an impact on the situation of the Soviet Union, for it had to take active measures against the threat of war from the capitalist powers, the threat generated by the crisis. In order to restore the economy of the Soviet Union, which was destroyed as a result of the First World War and began 80 after the Civil War Revolution, on the proposal of Lenin, a new economic policy, NEP, was adopted. In 1927, total production in the USSR reached the pre-war level. Thus, the necessary prerequisites were created for building a socialist economy. At that time, the economic situation of the Soviet Union, which inherited backward economy from Tsarist Russia, could not be satisfactory in comparison with the capitalist powers. In industry, there was a large proportion of industries producing consumer goods. Most of the means of production had to be imported from abroad. The level of technology was lower than in capitalist countries. This situation had to be rectified immediately. In October 1928, the first 5-year plan was launched in the USSR, aimed at industrializing the country and socialist transformation of agriculture. Thanks to the laboring upsurge of the people, dubbed socialist competition, the first 5-year plan was completed by December 1932, 9 months ahead of schedule. The industry has made a rapid leap forward. The Soviet Union, as an industrial power, took the second place after the United States in the world. The Dnieper hydroelectric power station, the Stalingrad tractor plant, and the Magnitogorsk iron and steel works gained wide fame. In the USSR, machine building, automobile, tractor, aviation and other industries were recreated, which developed at a particularly rapid pace. The construction of railways, The development of the Asian part of Russia and other activities were important to strengthen the country's defense. Agricultural mechanization grew, collective farms were created everywhere, the foundations of capitalism were largely eradicated in the countryside. Simultaneously with the development of the socialist economy, there was an increase in the material and cultural level of the working people. National income, amounting to 35 billion in 1930, 81 rubles, in 1933 reached 50 billion. The number of workers and employees over the same period increased from 14,500 and 30,000 to 20,880,000 people, and wages increased by more than 50%. At the same time, a 7-hour workday was introduced. A very prominent phenomenon was the active involvement of women in production. Instead of dark, damp shacks not suitable for habitation, entire neighborhoods of beautiful bright houses were built. The working outskirts of cities had become more comfortable than the central quarters. The old village began to disappear, where the church towered in the most prominent place. In the foreground stood the sturdy houses of a policeman, the priest in a fist, and in the backyards were dilapidated shacks of peasants. A new village has appeared, in which there is a club, a radio, a cinema, a school, a library and a nursery, a village equipped with tractors and combines, threshers and cars. Of course, these transformations within the country ran into a number of obstacles. The 5-year plan had to overcome many difficulties. Considerable sacrifices were made by the people. So, not only the Kulaks opposed the collectivization of agriculture, but also some sections of the peasantry, whose consciousness was backward. Therefore, the implementation of collectivization did not always go smoothly. But the perseverance and efforts of the people ultimately bore fruit. A socialist state was built. The 1936 Constitution summed up the successes of the Soviet Union. The Second World War proved the strength of the socialist system created in the USSR. Even among the leaders of the capitalist states there were people who openly expressed their amazement at strengthening the power of the country of the Soviets. Back in 1931, Nakajima Kumakichi, one of the prominent theorists of the capitalist circles of Japan, who at that time held the post of Minister of Commerce, said, "I am really very susceptible to Russophobia at present, and therefore the possibility is not ruled out that all that I will say next will be perceived as the chatter 82 of another Russophobe." But reflecting on what will happen if the 5-year plan for the industrialization of Russia is completed, I fall into pessimism about the prospects for the development of industry in our country. Before the beginning of the last 1930 year, I was sure that the 5-year plan for the industrialization of Russia would end in failure for the following 3 reasons. Firstly, due to the miserable life of the people in Russia and the lack of material resources. Secondly, due to financial difficulties, and thirdly, as a result of the enlightenment of youth. However, looking back at the real results of the past 1929-30 years, I came to the conclusion that Russia will certainly fulfill its plan. And I'm thinking about how the implementation of this plan will primarily affect Japan, as well as the industry of all other countries of the world. This involuntary feeling of surprise at the successes of the Soviet Union eventually turned into a feeling of hatred and fear. foreign policy of the Soviet Union. It must be taken into account that the development of the Soviet Union took place in conditions of isolation, with a capitalist environment. Established after the end of the First World War, the League of Nations was an organ of peace that guaranteed collective security. But, on the other hand, it was an organization born during the intervention against Soviet Russia, and from the point of view of the Soviet government, it was created to isolate the USSR and prepare for an attack on it. In 1922, the Soviet Union concluded a Treaty of Rapport with Germany, which was also in a state of isolation, which provided for the mutual rejection of reparations, the mutual exchange of essential goods, etc. The conclusion of this treaty was the first act of recognition of the Soviet Union by foreign states. But other European countries felt the need to restore trade relations with Soviet Russia. Therefore, in 1924-83, England and Italy, followed by other European states, whose economies were in a state of stagnation, went one after another to the recognition of the Soviet Union. And only the United States, which, in comparison with other capitalist states, experienced less economic difficulties, did not recognize the Soviet Union for 10 years. But the recognition of Soviet Russia by a number of capitalist states did not at all mean the liquidation of the state of isolation of the Soviet state. In October 1924, a letter addressed to the British Communist Party was published by one of the leaders of the Comintern, Zinoviev. This letter, which incited the British Communist Party to rebellion, was the main reason for the fall of the Labour government, which recognized the Soviet Union, in the elections held 5 days after the publication of the letter. The so-called incident with Zinoviev's letter 18 was a clear example of the anti-Soviet policy pursued by England. In 1926, during the famous strike of the English miners, the Conservative government, which took an even more reactionary position towards the USSR, broke off diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. As for the Locarno Accords of 1925, from the point of view of international relations, they have created a security guarantee system with respect to Germany. In this case, the inviolability of the borders between Germany, on the one hand, and Belgium and France, on the other, was guaranteed, while the question of the eastern borders of the USSR was not even raised at the Locarno Conference. Therefore, it is natural that the Soviet Union regarded the Locarno system as anti-Soviet. From the very beginning, the Soviet government, in principle and consistently, opposed the imperialist, 84 predatory wars. Indeed, being surrounded by capitalist states, the Soviet Union was to bring peace to the main principle of its foreign policy. He concluded non-aggression or neutrality treaties with his neighbors, Turkey 1925, Germany, Afghanistan and Lithuania 1926 and Iran 1927, and thus ensured the inviolability of his borders. The Soviet Union was the first to declare its consent to participate in the work of the Committee for the Preparation of the Conference on Disarmament, which was to meet in Geneva in May 1926. Litvinov was appointed Soviet representative to the committee. The Soviet Union proposed a ban on military preparations, which made an impression of a bomb that exploded, criticized the Versailles and Locarno systems for their inconsistency. In 1928, the USSR became a party to the War Ban Pact. In the face of the threat of an aggressive war that could arise as a result of the economic crisis and in connection with the growing influence of fascism, the Soviet government made every effort to clarify its peace policy. In addition, the USSR concluded a series of non-aggression treaties with neighboring states, Finland, Poland, Latvia, Estonia, and then with France 1932 and Italy 1933. In May 1933, the International Conference on Disarmament adopted a resolution introduced by the Soviet Union on the definition of aggression. In 1934, the USSR joined the League of Nations, from which Japan and Germany had already left. At the same time, with the support of France, the USSR introduced the project of the so-called Eastern Locarno 19 systems of agreements that were supposed to cover 7 countries of Eastern Europe: Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Germany and the Soviet Union. But to implement this 85 project failed, as Poland opposed him, which was under the influence of Nazi Germany. After Germany, in violation of the military articles of the Versailles Treaty, began rearmament in 1935, the Soviet Union and France entered into a mutual assistance treaty. As can be seen from the above, the question of guarantees of collective security was considered by the Soviet Union not only as an abstract issue of relations between states. It was characteristic that, according to the USSR, this guarantee should be based on the solidarity of the masses, which found expression in the creation of popular fronts for the struggle against fascism. However, under the conditions of the global economic crisis and the increasing threat of war, a peaceful foreign policy alone was not enough to carry out the construction of socialism. In order to eliminate the military threat at that time and ensure the development of Soviet society, it was necessary to have, moreover, real power. Therefore, the 5-year plan aimed at increasing the country's defense capability. The main emphasis in this regard was placed on the development of heavy industry, as a result of which, inevitably, the production of consumer goods and the increase in the living standards of the people were somewhat delayed. As regards strengthening the defense capabilities of the Soviet Union, the following figures can be given here. In 1927, there were 85 squadrons in the USSR, numbering 700 aircraft. In 1931, 194 squadrons, 1,600 aircraft. In 1933, the number of aircraft increased sharply, reaching 2,500. By the end of 1928, the Soviet Union had 220 tanks. By June 1931, the number of tanks reached 500, and in January 1933 there were already 1,500. That is, in a short time the number of tanks increased by several times. The efforts of the Soviet Union to strengthen defense capabilities were highly appreciated by military specialists of the capitalist countries. For example, the English military historian Liddell warned about the growth of military power of the USSR. 86. Garth. This assessment was presented by political figures of the capitalist states as evidence of a threat from the Soviet Union and was used as an excuse to incite anti-Soviet sentiment and the arms race in their countries. New course. The economic crisis that began in the United States in October 1929 was deepening. At every opportunity, President Hoover stated that the country's economy was based on a completely healthy basis, but in fact the seriousness of the situation refuted this optimistic assessment. The value of shares in all sectors of American industry fell at an incredible pace. In 1932, the level of industrial production in the United States was half the level of 1929. Tens of thousands of industrial enterprises and trading firms went bankrupt and closed. There have been many cases of suicide of owners of bankrupt enterprises. The number of unemployed, which amounted to 3 million in 1930, rose to 7 million in 1931 and exceeded 12 million in 1933. General stagnation was observed in agriculture. Farmers' incomes fell by 1/3. The usual picture of street life was the figure of an unemployed person selling apples, as well as crowds of hungry people, besieging restaurants in battle to get leftover food. One journalist described the situation in the mines as follows: on the slope of the mountain in terrible conditions, several thousand miners live, 4 families huddle in one cramped room. They support their existence by eating roots and grass. At the same time, as is usually the case during a crisis, there were frequent cases when cars and surplus goods were destroyed. Merchant ships with a total displacement of 1 million tons were destroyed, several 100,000 liters of milk were poured, 6,400,000 pigs were slaughtered. President Hoover tried by creating a company to finance economic recovery to provide 87 financial assistance to banks and other institutions, and by organizing construction work to eliminate unemployment. However, all these half measures failed. In the midst of a deep depression, which was about to end in disaster, Hoover was powerless to save the situation, which brought fierce criticism from the people. People who lost their homes in cities built shacks on vast wastelands. Villages of these shacks were called Hooverville. The American people began a gradual review of their attitude to the existing social system. At that time, the theory spread in the USA that the crisis could be overcome thanks to the achievements of science and the growth of productivity. But such statements could not calm the masses. Politicians such as Boss Long appeared on the scene, campaigning for the division of wealth of the wealthy. Every now and then strikes of workers arose, the unemployed staged demonstrations. In July 1932, production reached its lowest level. In the presidential election held in November 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president, proclaiming the New Deal. After Woodrow Wilson, who served as president during the First World War, he was the first president of the Democratic Party in 12 years. In his speech on the occasion of taking office on March 4, 1933, Roosevelt pointed out the need for reforms based on strict control and insisted on immediate action. "The only thing we should be afraid of," he said, "is fear itself. Our urgent task is not to discuss, but to act." Roosevelt immediately set about implementing his plans. The day after taking office, he began to conduct extraordinary events in the field of finance. He imposed an embargo on the export of gold and silver and announced a temporary cessation of operations by all banks in the country. An emergency session of Congress was convened on March 9, which passed laws over 3 months, on assistance to the unemployed, on Regulation 88 of Agriculture, on the administration of the Tennessee River Valley, an emergency banking law, the law on the restoration of national industry (NIRA), and 15 others, the most important laws stipulated by the New Deal. Strictly speaking, these laws were contradictory in content, but at the same time they made it possible to strengthen government intervention in all areas of industry, in relations between workers and entrepreneurs, to overcome the crisis thanks to a regulated economy. In addition, these laws made it possible to take a number of measures in the field of social policy and prevent the development of the revolutionary movement. In general, they were aimed at saving American capitalism. In order to enforce the laws adopted under the president, the so-called Brain Trust was created, which was in charge of the national administration for the restoration of industry and other organizations of the so-called upper cabinet. The president received broad legislative powers from Congress. From the point of view of the long-standing and traditional separation of legislative, executive and judicial powers in American democracy, the provision of legislative powers to the president was a genuine revolution. The president concentrated unprecedented power in his hands. But Roosevelt himself held democratic views. In addition, preparing for the next election, he had to enlist the support of the working people. In this regard, in July 1935, Wagner's Law was passed, regulating the relationship between workers and employers. This law provided for the right to conclude collective bargaining agreements by unions and the right to strike. In January 1936, Roosevelt even called in his New Year's message to overthrow the aristocracy in the economy. In the same period, the reactionary U.S. Supreme Court declared unconstitutional a series of laws passed under the New Deal. Thus, from this 89 point of view, Roosevelt's position differed from that of German-Italian fascists. American capitalism has demonstrated both its strength and its flexibility. Thanks to the New Deal, he seemed to temporarily recover. In 1936, industrial production increased by 30% compared to 1933. But the New Deal itself is a policy of restoring capitalism, which is in the midst of an economic crisis, and its essence was no different from the policies pursued in other capitalist countries. His ability to resolve the crisis was limited. Moreover, thanks to the New Deal, the concentration of huge capital has increased, the profits of the capitalists have increased. At the same time, almost all Roosevelt's attempts to expand production by increasing the purchasing power of the people were unsuccessful. The number of unemployed still exceeded the number of workers employed in industry. Due to rising prices, the life of the people did not improve. Often labor conflicts broke out, the organization of trade unions grew. At the end of 1937, the U.S. economic crisis erupted again. The Roosevelt government began to look for a way out of the crisis in the militarization of the economy. Given all this, one cannot assume that the United States is not involved in the outbreak of World War II. Nevertheless, the New Deal, which was a set of measures aimed at overcoming the crisis, set as its main goal the expansion and development of the domestic market, which made it possible to preserve the democratic system in the United States itself, and its domestic policy, and to act within a certain framework in foreign policy against aggression. Roosevelt's policy toward Latin America is known as the Good Neighbor policy. It was a pan-American policy, aimed at destroying the influence of England in the Latin American countries and creating a bloc of the countries of the American continent. However, in accordance with this policy, the right of the United States to keep its troops in Cuba, in Haiti, Panama and others was cancelled. 90 countries, the independence of these states was guaranteed, mutual agreements were concluded. In other words, international relations on the American continent have softened somewhat. In 1933, the Roosevelt government recognized the Soviet Union, with which the United States had not previously had diplomatic relations. In 1935, an American-Soviet trade agreement was concluded. These actions were dictated by the following considerations. In the field of economics, by expanding trade with the Soviet Union, the United States intended to overcome the reduction in trade turnover, and in the political sphere, to shackle Japan and the Far East. The post of Secretary of State, which at the time of Hoover was held by Stimson, passed to Hull. However, Roosevelt, in January 1933, before assuming the presidency, said that America must strictly observe international treaties in its foreign policy, hinting that he intends to follow the Stimson principle, which did not approve of Japanese aggression. But be that as it may, the United States was drawn into the crucible of the World War step by step. In the first period of Roosevelt's presidency, public opinion adhered to the old American tradition of non-interference in European affairs, a tradition that placed the recovery of the domestic economy at the head of the fragility. The Neutrality Act, adopted in 1935, prohibited the supply of war materials to warring countries. This law was used during the war in Abyssinia. In 1937, during the Spanish Civil War, the law on neutrality was also applied to this country, but in this case the principle, pay and take out, was proclaimed. It was a policy of providing trade benefits for the United States. Thus, the opportunity arose to benefit from the war. In the Sino-Japanese War that began that year, the law on neutrality was no longer applied. 91. So the United States, which, during the implementation of the New Deal, held the position of suppressing undisguised aggression, nevertheless entered the path of gradually drawing the country into the war.